Sean Boyd. Sean.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to say before we start this session that Danielle, you did an excellent job. It was very reassuring to hear the senator and see that there's an alignment of thought and there's some thoughtful sort of thinking going on about how we can cooperate in an important part of the world and an important part of this country. And we're fortunate to have Paul here from Davie that can sort of help to round out and give us some insight into that part of it. But so we'll round out the day sort of on the financing part of this, and we all know that this isn't going to be cheap. This is going to cost money. It's going to cost serious money. It's going to require investment. But I think what we've been able to see over the last couple of days is that there's a developing sense of urgency, but there's a better understanding about the opportunity set that exists in the North for all of us in business, in the communities, in government, as Canadians. And the key will be is to be able to coordinate everybody's efforts in a way that we're creating conditions that investors want to invest. And that'll be important. So today we're going to be discussing with investors that invest and investors that are managing money and are responsible for generating returns, as well as companies that are actually involved in important infrastructure in the North that are going to help us realize the potential. So a couple of background points that we've seen over the last little while, and given the recent developments here in North America, it was also good to see in one of the earlier sessions that our friends in Europe are taking notice. And they're taking notice from the perspective of, how do we help in a way that's respectful, in a way that sort of defers to us in terms of how we think about how things are going to unfold in the North. And that plays through to some of the large European investors. As Jessica pointed out, we've seen the pension fund in Norway looking at ways that they have relaxed their rules to look at more dual-purpose infrastructure investments that include military, which is important because I think we all understand that part of the opportunity is going to be taking advantage of the spending that the government is committed to do in the North and using it in a way that's we can leverage off of it to create more positive investment conditions. The defense policy, I think, is really important, not just in the infrastructure investment, but to understand the defense industry needs to understand what industry is doing as well, and where industry is likely going to invest and locate infrastructure. And as we like to say, the defense industry needs to understand from a mining perspective where the best rocks are, because that's likely where the best mines are. And so that comes down to a lot of the coordination which will improve the conditions for investment. So what I'd like to do is have each of the panelists introduce themselves, but also as part of that introduction, maybe they can give us some insight as to how the events of the last week has maybe changed how they think about their business, or how they think about the opportunity set, or how they think about being able to contribute to the opportunity set that exists in the North. And we'll start with Paul.
Great. Paul Barrett. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for Davie Shipbuilding. We are 200 years old this year, very proud to say, a continuously operating Canadian business based in Quebec along the banks of the St. Lawrence. We build icebreakers. We're going to be building 90% of Canada's heaviest icebreakers. We also have a business in Finland, Helsinki Shipyard, which is the world's leader in icebreaker construction, having built about 50% of the world fleet over the last 70 years. And we're now looking to also open a business, shipbuilding business in America. And we see great opportunities in supplying these very specialized assets for the Arctic. And what I would say is there are 46 reasons why icebreakers are really important, and that's because that is the size of the Russian polar fleet. 20% or more of their economy is touching the Arctic in some way or another. Canada has a 30-ship order book, which is incredibly impressive, but it's just an order book, and we at the moment have a little more than the piece of metal that Senator Murkowski showed us. But the ambition is there, but the execution is not there in terms of it being fast enough to help us to keep the economy flowing, to make sure that we're connected and engaged and present in the Arctic. So what we've done is we've basically got an acquisition strategy which allows us to bring the best experience in the world and bring it to Canada and bring it to hopefully America, and then actually have something which means we can play catch up so the opportunities are not lost forever. And that's really where we're at.
Thank you, Paul. We'll come back to that in a minute. There's a lot of things that we'd like to just sort of dig into, but Lisa?
Yeah, my name's Lisa Mitchell. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. We're a membership-driven organization representing the infrastructure industry in Canada, from public sector owners, so the federal government, right down to the municipalities, all the way through to those that build, design, operate, maintain infrastructure in Canada. But we also include the financing component as well too, so the major banks, pension funds, equity investors, asset managers, and the advisory community. So we're kind of the one place that you can get everybody involved in the delivery of infrastructure in Canada all in one shop. That puts us in a pretty unique position in terms of trying to find innovative and creative ways to fund and finance and deliver infrastructure and services across Canada. In terms of reaction to the last week, I mean, it feels like it was a bit ever-changing. But I think where we've landed is, a bit, this is likely not over. We've got 30 days reprieve, but for us, it very much feels like 30 days to get a bit, our ducks in a row. I think from infrastructure delivery, we're already dealing with significant pressures in terms of inflation and labor shortages. And that's all, post-COVID, recovery is, still a thing. And so in that context, to add on the layer of additional supply chain issues, similar to the auto industry, we've got some things that are, incorporated into our infrastructure that cross the border, a number of times between the two countries. If there's tariffs going down and then tariffs coming back, and so there's a lot that remains to be seen. We're taking a bit of a very practical approach. I think we're having a town hall with members next week. We've put together a bit of an issue brief after some initial consultations with public and private. Really, our intent is, the negotiations are happening at a high level, but practically speaking, what mitigation strategies can we collectively, as the public and private sector, put in place? Are there supply chain supply chain issues that we can avoid by going to other places? Is interprovincial trade an issue, and how do we, tackle that? What can we do to fix it sort of en famille, like together, and then where are we really stuck, and then maybe we need to place some advocacy efforts there. So, we're trying not to, it is concerning, it's anxiety inducing for a lot of people, but how do we kind of take a deep breath, take a step back, and really look at some practical solutions where we can?
Rebecca?
My name is Rebecca Connelly. I am the Vice President of Strategy and Engagement for Det'on Cho. We are an Indigenous development corporation that is owned by the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. Traditional lands include the city of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, as well as the location of the 3 existing diamond mines that are operating in the Northwest Territories. Our 36-year history has included a tremendous focus on supporting the mining industry, and as was mentioned earlier, they are in sunset years. The diamond market has not been kind recently, and so over the last, I would say, 5 years or so, there's been a real focus for us to look at what is our future? How do we continue to provide opportunities for the First Nation that we work for? And that has included looking at things like infrastructure and investments. And so I think that tariffs, but also the attention that's been focused on the Arctic through conversations about the 51st state and Greenland, really drive an opportunity for us to become a part of the conversation on how do we determine and make the world understand that, you know, the North, Canada's North, is in fact part of Canada.
Thank you. And Derron?
Good afternoon. Derron Bain. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Concert Infrastructure. Concert's an investor, developer, and manager, primarily of public-private partnerships across Canada. Our shareholders are 10 BC-based management and union pension plans, small to medium-sized pension plans, of which a number of them are BC building trades. Most notably, one of our projects is the Iqaluit Airport, so we're the primary investor manager of that asset in Iqaluit. That obviously positions us quite well in terms of understanding the jurisdiction, the challenges, and the issues. I think in terms of the challenges of the last week, I actually go, before we even get to tariffs, there's a bigger challenge, and I maybe sound like a broken record because I think I made the point last year. And it applies to both the federal government and the territorial governments. With respect to infrastructure, there's no strategy, and therefore there's no priorities, there's no plan, and there's limited capability to deliver. And so from an equity investor's perspective in infrastructure, we go where there's at least some degree of stability and certainty in terms of pursuits and investments we make. And frankly, right now, when we look across Canada, there are other jurisdictions that have the strategy, priorities, plan, and capability to see these projects through. So as I say, I would say that's a fundamental issue and challenge. I think it's a theme that was picked up on an earlier panel, and it carries across into this panel as well.
Yeah, those are all good points. And I think when you think about that, that's an issue and a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because once we get sort of everything lined up and create that that big picture and that action plan and that understanding of the strategy, then there's going to be work to do. So one of the questions I think we would have, even in the mining business, because we would also be looking for funding at some point depending on the number of deposits, what is the capacity in the public-private partnership world to do more? And is there an ability with your firms to utilize or take advantage of outside funding sources out of the country, that type of thing? We're just trying to get a sense of the capacity, so we'll start with Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably good to set a bit of a context in terms of the term public-private partnership and what that means, because I think sometimes it can be applied to just any relationship that the public and the private sector have. And the thing is, in terms of leveraging private capital, there needs to be some parameters. Public-private partnerships are globally used. They are it's an umbrella term for a variety of different procurement models that includes and leverages private capital. In the Canadian context, they have a very specific definition, but we are doing quite a bit of work with our members to expand that. But there are some key attributes that we look for, and that's the ability to drive innovation and efficiencies, looking at the life cycle of the asset, and procuring, looking at with the life cycle in mind, transferring risk. So looking at the risks inherent in a project and transferring them or allocating them to the person best able to manage them. So sometimes that's the private partner, sometimes government needs to retain that risk. And all of that housed in the leveraging of private capital and really also harnessing the expertise of the people that not only build these types of projects in Canada, but sometimes globally. So that's really sort of what we're looking at. Generally, thus far in the Canadian context, and we have more than 300 projects across the country, it's really been focused on public infrastructure. So we're looking at water, wastewater. We've got, the first airport in North America that Derron's involved in, roads, bridges, hospitals, schools. So more of that sort of community-based level. That being said, as we sort of look at other opportunities, there are P3 models that involve revenue streams. So whether they be toll roads or, energy is moving, there's energy contracts that look a lot like public-private partnerships. So there is the opportunity to to expand, and we're working through that. But in terms of attracting that private sector investment in a public-private partnership as the market knows it, it's got to be relatively streamlined with what the market knows. And to Derron's point, you've got to have a really strong, third party, counterpart on the government side to be along with you. The P3s are not P-free. The government, the industry is not going to come in and pay for your water, wastewater, and have governments just sort of walk away. These assets are generally publicly owned. You're just using the expertise of the private sector on the other side. And again, that can include Indigenous partnerships as well too. We've got a great example in Northwest Territories, the Clecho All-Season Road, which is the road leading from the main highway I'm sure most people in this room are familiar, but down to Edmonton, up to the community of Wati. And it also includes an equity investment by the Clecho government. So we have a lot, and I think the loan guarantee program by the federal government, I think, is going to be a great thing to help sort of encourage those types of relationships and partnerships.
Just to just add on there with the Indigenous loan program, what we were finding is that there is a lack of sophistication within the community, within the Inuit associations that we're dealing with in terms of the whole process around the loan program. We find it a bit challenging. The opportunity is there, and so your business can really be helpful in having them understand the opportunity. So
I think that's an important point in that it's key to partner with entities and companies that actually can deliver the projects. And from my perspective, part of that obligation is to partner with local Indigenous communities, and that's certainly an approach that we've looked at in Nunavut. I think, as building on what Lisa said, like traditional procurement models are broken and are not fit for purpose in 2025. Like a 1950s approach to military housing doesn't work in 2025. A 1970s approach to ship procurement doesn't work in 2025, and a traditional approach to social infrastructure doesn't work in 2025. I can point you to a long-term care facility that's been built in Rankin Inlet. It's 2 years over schedule. Just think about the social and economic costs of that. There's better ways and more certain ways to deliver these infrastructure assets moving forward. And we need, as I said in my opening comments, the federal and territorial governments to understand that and to start to build the capacity and capability to work as partners with industry, with local Indigenous communities and investors to get this stuff done.
I know Paul had a comment, and then we'll go to Rebecca.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we actually used an infrastructure model in terms of build, own, operate, transfer, but applied it to a defense asset, to a ship, which we also hope the Asterix is a supply ship that we converted and supplied to the Royal Canadian Navy in a very short space of time because there was a real schedule and cost need. And the great thing about that was that we privately financed it, took all of the risk, and then we offer that as a ship, as a service. So we still own it, we crew it, and we lease with an option for the Royal Canadian Navy to buy. And that has meant that while the joint support ships are being built by C-SPAN, that we've had a genuine blue water Navy capability. And we hope, as Lisa Makowski has shown, that we desperately need these assets ASAP, that we can apply those types of infrastructure financing models to getting the icebreakers into play as well. Nothing confirmed, but it's definitely something we want to discuss.
Rebecca?
So you mentioned the lack of capacity amongst Indigenous organizations and how they participate in this. And I think that's an important point to take a pause on, because we have some organizations that are working with Hydro One and their $2 billion projects in Southwest Ontario. And I have another case where in November there was the startup of a new development corporation, and the gentleman asked me for a business case template. And so that is the range that you're dealing with. And many of these projects will take place in lands with a wide range of people and what they're able to bring to the table. And so I think we need to talk about how you build trust and how you find the right advisors. There's the and the NGO, the First Nations Major Project Coalition, that has helped several First Nations look at these large-scale projects. I think that we need to look at more opportunities to use the tools and the resources, but also making sure that on the investor side that they feel comfortable with the advisors. You know, like everyone sitting around the table needs to say, okay, we all have an understanding of what expertise we bring to the table, what we don't know, and how do we then come up with a solution together.
So specifically in the north, I think it's helpful as we all think about where we can make a contribution in the north or where we're going to put capital to work. It's often helpful to know what others are doing and thinking. Is there anything specifically of note that you're currently working on in the north or planning to work on in the north that you'd like to share with the group here today? Anything?
Okay, so I know yesterday my colleague Claire gave a presentation on an energy project that we're looking at, so very early stages of that, renewable energy in the Yellowknife region that would help, you know, supply needs, whether they be for mines that might be able to be established, critical mineral mines, or if there's a growth in defense at the Yellowknife Airport to meet the energy needs there, to have a backup to our hydro, which has been unreliable. So we've been burning millions of dollars of diesel. We have some of the highest energy rates in the country at 42 cents per kilowatt hour, I think was the last number I heard. It makes it a really challenging environment to do economic development. The other project that's a little further out, but I'm personally quite bullish on, is the Slave Geological Corridor. So this is a road that opens up an area of strong interest to the mineral industry, but with the work that's happening in Grays Bay and their potential road, we could have a connection for an Arctic deepwater port with a road connection directly to the south. So I mean, think about that multi-use. You have the military, you have other maybe Arctic operations that would need port refueling or whatever it may be. You have the commercial opportunities with mines, and then you have other opportunities for the community to use that. So
The concept of roads near geology is really what built the Abitibi in Quebec. If you look at the highway that runs from Val-d'Or to Rouen and into Ontario, we've got several mines within half a kilometer of the road. And so this idea in the north where you're building roads in close proximity to good geology is really what opens things up. So anybody else with, we'll get to Paul in a minute on the shipbuilding, but Lisa or Derron, anything that you see in the north coming that you're going to be involved with and help to move forward?
Yeah, I think the point Derron made, I think at the beginning, is the need for sort of an open and transparent strategy and understanding what the pipeline is. You know, we'd been quite hopeful with the announcement at the federal level for the National Infrastructure Assessment, which, you know, was to sort of do a Canada-wide assessment of the infrastructure needs and and I think that down in the south, but also for northern infrastructure, I think is really important because I think in the investment context that we have, I think investors have different risk appetites. So if they have a good understanding of what the plan is, and rather than project by project, I think that's helpful, especially if they understand who the the counterparties are in each specific project that might be coming. But I also think as I spoke at the outset, labor shortages, supply chain issues. In order to get private sector investment and the companies to come and build, the more insight they have into what's out there, what's coming, and what the timing looks like, I think the easier it is for them to get themselves organized and plan accordingly. So I think a big understanding of what the plans are outside of just a project by project, I think is going to be one of the key things to really catalyze the investment and the opportunities that are out there.
The wall we've run into, I mean, I laid it out in my opening comments, but it's really that capability gap on the other side. So, frankly, we've been asked to put forward a couple of proposals at the territorial government's request, and we invested a lot of time and effort, built partnerships with local Inuit development corps and investors, put those proposals forward, and the government's not in the position to even engage in a collaborative, productive conversation about that proposal that they asked for in the first instance. And so, that becomes a real frustration. And, we're certainly, again, we're invested, we're in that community, we understand how to work in that geography. We have the relationships, both in terms of our strategic partners from the south, but also strategic partners on the ground in Iqaluit and Nunavut. I think government needs to take a broader view of infrastructure as a facilitator for much more. It's about more than the infrastructure. It's about the social impact. It's about supporting, it goes hand in hand with housing, with the development of the mines, and they're like, it's just so circular, and there's so many public policy benefits and value drivers from social infrastructure that it's just frustrating that governments don't see that and won't move forward on that basis.
Yeah, we'll talk about the government in a minute, but I just wanted to stop with Paul for a minute, because investors like a story, particularly if they're thinking long term. And I think part of the creating conditions for investors to get comfortable is to create a story around the Arctic, which would include a strategy and how we're going to sort of lay it out. And Jessica had some thoughts on a seaway in the north, which is a big story. Paul, that would impact the thinking of you and your company. So where you sit, and you're dealing with multiple governments in an extremely important area, and probably one of the most important areas as we think about the north. So how do you see what you're doing in your position, being able to create that story for Canadians, but also serve as a bit of a catalyst or a nudge to get the government to actually not just put out a paper on a strategy, but actually a defined action plan that the rest of us in industry or as investors can look to as a roadmap?
I think it's a great question. And I think fundamentally that we do need to change the story about the Arctic. And at the moment, if there's a saying that money is a coward, right? So money is always going to run to the area of least risk and resistance. So how do you get from the Arctic being just a big environmental and societal and geopolitical challenge to an area which is a national imperative and a big opportunity? And I think really what needs to happen there is you need to build something like you would an equity story for any other type of investment. We've talked previously about having this kind of interactive roadmap of the various opportunities that exist. That doesn't exist. It exists for Russia, for example. It will tell you where everything is and the investments that have been made, but not currently for Canada. So how can we move towards that, and how can we make it so investors that are out there want to embed their capital and investment in the north, and they get a fear of missing out factor as well, that they need to come here because it's viable today and in the long term. So I think that needs to happen, and we need to have the young people that were talking earlier today. They're our chief Arctic investment officers of the future. They're the people that are going to tell us how we're going to come back and actually set something up here which is going to be viable today and long into the future. So when you talk about all of this with the government, how do those discussions land? Is it resonating? No, it lands really badly. Because, and I'm just going to be honest, because there should be a dividend for creative ideas for something so important. But unfortunately, there seems to be an attitude that if it's something that needs to be done differently and more rapidly, then it has to be an absolute emergency to do this, right? So it's not what I'm talking about is an insurance policy to ensure that we can benefit, or everybody can benefit from the Arctic's opportunities. But if you speak to the government, it's like, oh my goodness, it sounds too hard, it's too difficult, it doesn't really compute with our processes. And I'm talking about procurement right now, which for us is incredibly difficult to traverse. And we're not blaming any individuals, but the system does not allow us to do what we're supposed to do, which is get the assets that Canada needs into the Arctic as soon as possible. So that's a big challenge for us at the moment, hence why we ended up buying Helsinki Shipyard. And by the way, we bought Helsinki Shipyard from Russian interests, which if you want to take several years off your life, try and do that, but do it in a perfect way. So it goes through sanction and finance checks and everything else. But the reason we did that was because an asset came on stream which would allow us to take expertise which exists nowhere else and put it in Canada's lap to use to make sure that it can now get its assets into play as quickly as possible. And that is also a big challenge because you have to be careful with Canadian content and all of those things. But workforce exchange, technology exchange should be allowed, and we should be able to move that forward.
So the regulation, does it stand in your way as you deal with the government and look? I know you're building infrastructure, but as you're talking to the government about investment,
Yeah,
what would the
the
roadblocks
biggest
be?
challenge in terms of government-supported infrastructure, certainly from a territorial perspective, often comes down to their territorial debt cap. And so that's held out as an impediment to their ability to support the costs of social and community infrastructure. I guess from my perspective, when we put a layer of geopolitics and as I said before, economic and social impact and the importance of those issues for the country, one would think that the federal government might step up and provide some relief or some support to get around that type of an issue.
I think the other issue, and full disclosure for those that don't know me, I've been in this role for 3 years in the private sector, but I have a public sector background, so I'll choose my words carefully having lived it. But part of the challenge that we also find too is the federal government, and it happens in the, to some degree at the large provinces as well too, is they're fragmented. They don't talk to each other. So you can walk into D&D and talk about an Arctic strategy, but there is no necessarily conversation between them and other departments that might be going on. Then you throw in the mix of trying to do something different, and they go a bit squirrely. We've been advocating for quite some time, and I used to work at an organization called PPP Canada that had a role in centralizing some of the federal procurements, and that crown was dissolved by the federal government in 2017, but we've been advocating for, it doesn't have to be another crown, but something that centralizes procurement at the federal level so that knowledge transfer that can happen, so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. I mean, our former colleagues of mine and, members at PSPC, industry doesn't fully trust them right now, and trust is a big word, but it's difficult to do business with them. So we're hopeful that we can kind of get back to a more coordinated approach at the federal government, because I think just it's never going to work if we continue to have a federal government that doesn't coordinate internally.
I think what's interesting is that when we talk about the North, you can list a half a dozen policy boxes that are easily ticked off, which should be red meat for a politician, and it still doesn't sort of seem to resonate. But it's apparent when we go, I can sit in front of a deputy minister and talk about what we're doing, but if I'm going with an Indigenous leader from a community, the government officials are sitting up straighter, they're paying more attention. So that is one way where I think we can do a better job as industry and as investors to hammer home the message. And maybe Rebecca, I think you might have some thoughts on that.
No, I completely agree. I think that there is a lot of appetite out there for Indigenous groups, I will say broadly, both the governments and companies, to have those conversations and to be part of the decision making. I think that there's an opportunity to help bridge the gaps in knowledge sometimes and just information. that can be filled by some of the existing partners. So, Sean, your company has spent decades building relationships. I think you have the trust of certain groups. And so how could that be leveraged in terms of when you're sitting down with people and building that trust? Similarly, we have some of our clients and some of our joint venture partners that we have built those deep relationships with. And even the in-house business knowledge that our company has, how can we then maybe help translate and apply the DNA values that form our company and our North Star into business reality?
Derron?
I guess one of the other points to make too is, and it's no surprise, geography is a challenge, but I say that from the perspective of in Nunavut, you have a number of Inuit development corps or Inuit agencies, and making sure they're all aligned and they all get some benefit can often be an impediment, right? So if one wins, another one potentially loses. So again, you're back to that. Let's set a strategy. Let's set priorities. Let's make sure that you're managing those issues, because in absence of that, that's what we run into is somebody gets something, somebody doesn't, so they're going to oppose it, and you're stopped in your tracks again. The other point I would make too is it's my understanding that in Nunavut, NTI is sitting on a significant amount of capital that's meant to be invested in the community, so they can also be a catalyst here. Certainly, it's going to be a drop in the bucket, but they could be a catalyst to start moving in the right direction, I think, on the right priorities.
And I think, just to jump in, I think when they have that investment, the question of free, prior, informed consent is settled. It's more than settled if it's a public-private partnership, right? They're an Indigenous partnership because they're at that table, and so that helps the risk profile lower a little bit for the investor.
And I think one of the challenges with the perception of, oh, I got this, they don't get that, is there's not enough activity, so that there's not enough of a pipeline of activity where they can feel comfortable, oh, we missed that one, so we're going to get this one. And that's part of sort of elevating the activity level and getting an action plan. So I think one of the other challenges is the ability to coordinate and tell the story. Paul's story is relatively easy to tell. Our story, mining's relatively easy to tell. But we could tell a better story if we could find a way to link these businesses. I'll just use an example as our team, and this is a small example, as our team is using the fact that we have a defined barge season to bring up components for housing into Rankin, 25 houses a year for the next 5. We're still working on it, and we're saving the community a substantial amount of money. Small money, but big money for them, small money for us because we're coming anyways.
But big social equity for you there as well. Yeah,
but any ideas on how we can better cooperate to leverage off of the activity that's getting done? Because as you've said, Derron, you said, this is a massive area. We all know that. And if we can coordinate our efforts, we can be way more efficient and effective. I think we all know that. Is there any ideas or any thoughts as you think about your own businesses on how we can collectively coordinate our efforts to be more efficient?
And in our space, I mean, that representing the industry, storytelling is a bit what we do, and I think we're always looking to, especially as we try and work with governments to understand the benefits of public-private partnerships. Really why we do this is governments, we're looking for better ways to not have, cost overruns and time delays and get actually what they were paying for and, in building public infrastructure. And we have good news stories, and I think that the connective threads are really important. Even thinking of, the Herb Gray Parkway for the longest time was the road to nowhere because the Windsor-Detroit Bridge hadn't been, commissioned, procured yet. And that connective threads between projects and for regions, I think, is really important. We talked to the, Bruce Power as, public-private partnership in the nuclear space and what they've done for that community. And you and I were talking about that earlier in terms of what you've done for the community as well, and I think there is an element of that storytelling. I think people are, despite the fact that we have a lot of private sector investment in this country, I still think people are trying to understand exactly what that means. Not everybody knows inherently what private investment in infrastructure means, but it is community building, regardless of what the asset is, and has connections to everyday lives, whether it's clean water or better health services, or whether it's it's the mining and the economic development. So I think there needs to be collectively a better storytelling on that.
I mean, it's also, for us, it's a story of growth. So ice-breaking services provided to a mine in Baffinland or Bay of Bothnia. What's key for us in terms of the urgency around the investment story is if you don't have the assets and services that we can provide, you often can't get your product in and out. So that is a barrier to growth. And that's actually happened with Sweden, with their Bay of Bothnia iron ore mines. They didn't have sufficient capacity of enough power to get in and out of the mine to actually get that to market. That impacted publicly listed companies' stock. So this is a bad thing. So we can be part of the growth story as long as you have the right assets to do the right services at the right time.
So in terms of making the investment case, sometimes when we hear the Arctic mentioned, it can be in a negative context, whether it's an issue with the water supply, or whether it's challenges at a mine, or whatever. But we actually do a lot of good things. Whether it's building infrastructure, whether it's financing infrastructure, whether it's building icebreakers, whether it's building mines. Any thoughts on how we can sort of elevate those stories? I know good news tends to not travel as well as bad news, but is there any thoughts on, I know we're trying to elevate what we do in the context of what's happening in the North. Is there any thoughts as you think about your business, particularly in terms of attracting new capital as they think about what you do well?
I mean, for us, it's a bit of a competitive secret, but as critical as I've been about the territorial government and the federal government, in terms of actually managing the airport in Iqaluit, they've been great partners. And, it's a public-private partnership. There's the black and white of a contract, but obviously the risks and the conditions in the Arctic can't always be predicted and can't always be planned for in advance. And we've certainly found, again, that engagement and the management of that asset to be very positive, and we would have no hesitation like investing in other assets and other infrastructure in that jurisdiction on that basis. So that's been our experience. Again, it's that initial kind of strategy and plan that's the wall for us. Anybody else?
Rebecca or
I think just thinking back to the Green Power Project, one of the things was it was born out of the NRCan's Critical Mineral Infrastructure Fund and supporting a potential critical minerals infrastructure project and mine near Yellowknife. But really wanting to look beyond that, what would we do with that excess power? Can it be put back into the city grid to provide more reliable power? Can it help reduce cost? Does it provide other opportunities like data centers or other things that have huge power draws that right now don't make economic sense? So is that piece of infrastructure, maybe doesn't make the best business case on its own, but when you look at the add-on effects, it's the people who are first to market with that data center don't have to do that. It's already been done. It's there from them. It's enabled for that next step.
Yeah, that sends a great message to the community that you're helping to diversify and provide other opportunities.
It's also about overcoming risk, right? So if we talked about earlier about how you're going to get people to invest in the Arctic, we'll show that actually you can overcome risk and you can get tangible returns, right? So what you described there, if you could execute that, that's a great story, very topical, and I'm sure you could find potential investors for that sort of thing, right?
So if you think about, let's say, the Department of National Defense, who has a spending plan, when you think about your businesses, I know you've probably got you know, some strong contacts. We don't. From an investment point of view, is it easy to sort of get to the right people to make the right case? I see everybody shaking their head. That's not good. We find the same thing because we've got some opportunities that we'd like to share, and it's hard to sort of break through.
Yeah, I think, you know, in my experience, I both served in the military and then I've done business with them. The challenge is, frankly, their posting cycle, right? So we've seen great advocates for innovative procurement, P3s, military housing, other military assets, but the minute that champion gets posted out to his next duty, the opportunity quickly loses momentum. Somebody else has other priorities or objectives, and you're kind of back to square one. That's been the challenge I've seen with D&D. And to Lisa's point too, it's just at a federal level, the coordination between departments, D&D, Treasury Board, Finance, it's just not there.
Well, there's D&D, there's also Defense Construction Canada, the procurement arm, which isn't PSPC. And I don't know if DCC talks to PSPC and D&D is in the... See, you can see how very quickly you go down a wormhole of who's in charge of what. And I think that's the problem. But I think Derron's right. I mean, and it's not just the military. I think across the public service, you know, we were working with, at PPP Canada with a community, with 32 communities out in the Atlantic provinces on a combined Indigenous wastewater bundle of water and wastewater treatment facilities. And we had a deputy minister, which at INAC at the time, who was extremely supportive and was looking for ways to make this happen within the confines of, you know, the frameworks and the rules and, you know, and the acts that govern all of this. And that deputy got shuffled. And we were just stonewalled from then on. And nothing, I mean, there's work happening now, I think, in the Atlantic on those projects, but it's been, you know, 10 plus years since that all started. So that transient nature of the public service, in addition to the lack of coordination that they just inherently have, I think Derron's bang on. It's an ongoing problem.
So Paul, you reference, you know, you've got procurement challenges, and you're also dealing in a maritime context, which brings other sort of challenges. We're dealing in the mine permitting realm, which has its challenges. So we hear a lot of talk now, and we're hearing more talk in the last week. We're going to streamline regulation. So what does that actually mean? Do you get a sense, you know, we kind of hear that they're going to streamline and make it more efficient to permit mines. Do you get a sense, because it almost sounds like your challenges are tougher than us permitting a mine, do you get a sense that they're going to improve the procurement part of it, which is really going to stretch out the timeline on a lot of this stuff and this spending if they don't streamline that?
I mean, from a shipbuilding perspective, there's definitely a conversation that's going on at the moment, because they know essentially the system is kind of broken at the moment in terms of getting things contracted, getting things into a design phase, to a construction phase, to a delivery and deployment. This is very, very challenging, right, in the current environment. So there are talks about how to do that. We have a solution, and the solution is, let's move to a commercial style of contracting, which is hybridized so it's acceptable to government, which is kind of what we did with Asterix, which was this kind of build, own, operate, transfer model, right? And then what we has to happen is that the government needs to kind of get out of its own way and allow the experts to deliver the ship under supervision and in partnership on a performance-based contract or whatever that might be. But ultimately, it's about executing as opposed to just having a perfect process. So you end up getting a ship rather than a perfect procurement process, which is imperfect because you don't have a ship, right? So that's kind of where we are. But what I would say, to our customers' credit, conversations are ongoing at the moment. So let's hope that we can get a ship in the water before 2030. That would be great.
Any other comments from any of the panel? Because we're conscious we don't want to run over time. I know people have things that they've got to get to. So there is some time for some questions.
There's a bar at the back that getting set up. So
we'd be happy
we're standing
to,
between folks and drinks.
We'd be happy to take questions.
So respectfully, as an Inuk woman who is a beneficiary of my Nunavut land claim agreement, I highly recommend that any government representative and or business proponent recognize that NTI or our regional Inuit associations are not always the be-all and end-all. That as Agnico Eagle will let you know, that you also have to work with the communities and you have to work with the people, because if you put all your eggs in the Inuit org basket, you are going to often find yourselves maybe not getting the necessary support that you thought you had from the communities and our members or beneficiaries. So, while I understand and appreciate that, prior free informed consent absolutely is an important consideration, and that the Inuit organizations have that designated responsibility. But if you think that you can just end there, you are often going to find yourselves like what happened with a German company that wanted to do seismic testing off of the shores of Baffin Island. The community of Clyde River successfully challenged in court all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada that, that minister's decision was not adequate, despite the involvement of our Inuit organizations who participated in that engagement, and similarly, did not actually actively participate in the initial court challenge, but then came around when it came to the Supreme Court of Canada. So all I say is, you got to do actually a bit more than ending at the, designated Inuit organization if you want to move things forward.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Okay, maybe we'll leave it there. So I just want to thank everybody on the stage here for all the work that you're doing within your own area to bring investment dollars, bring attention to the opportunity set. Really high profile, Paul, and as Canadians, we love to see, ships, and we're going to be happy to see them traversing our waters in the Northwest Passage. And, but also want to take the time to thank Jessica and Madeline for a great another 2 days. And I think it'll be important that everybody that attended over the next 2 days, as you leave here, keep working hard, but keep thinking how we could collectively work together more effectively and more efficiently to make good things happen in the North. So thank you.
Very good. Great job.